Now I wanted to spend some time talking about energy because all living things in an ecosystem need energy. Life needs energy to continue on. And in an ecosystem, I want you to understand that energy travels through it and out again. So this is a one-way trip of energy. It goes into the ecosystem, it goes out of the ecosystem. It doesn't get recycled in the ecosystem at all. The passage of energy through an ecosystem we call a food chain. You may have heard of that before. So a food chain is kind of like who eats who in an ecosystem. It's looking at who's eating who, who's being eaten by who. We start every food chain with a producer. A producer, we also call them autotrophs. We've talked about that word before this year. Producers are those organisms that can make their own food using sunlight or some other source, but mainly sunlight. Or they make biomass. In other words, they build their bodies up using sunlight. We usually, when you think of this, we're talking about plants. So here's a nice aquatic plant. Here is some kind of a flower. And then we have also algae, and certain types of bacteria can be producers. So these are some algae called volvox. So producers make their own food. Now, producers are eaten by those organisms that we call primary consumers. The other name for these guys are heterotrophs or herbivores. This word herbivore refers to those organisms that eat. They're heterotrophs, they have to eat to get energy, but they eat producers, they eat plants or algae. So here are some different primary consumers. We have, of course, the caterpillar, we have a cow, we have a rabbit, and then this is a tilapia, which is a commonly eaten fish these days, and it's actually an herbivore fish. It eats plant material. Now, the primary consumers or herbivores are eaten by the secondary consumers, which are also heterotrophs. They have to eat, so we're talking usually about animals, and they eat the primary consumers. They eat the herbivores, so we call these guys carnivores. Okay, secondary consumers are carnivores. So here's some examples. We have a dragonfly eating an aphid. I don't know if you can see that. That's a little teeny bug that it's eating. We have the osprey eating the fish, and we've seen those around campus. And then a lion eating some kind of large animal. So we can think of a food chain as something like this. We have our producers. In this case, this is an aquatic food chain. So we have our algae, which are eaten by our primary consumers, which are a bunch of plankton, some little tiny crustaceans and things. And they're eaten by secondary consumers. These are some small fish that would eat the plankton, and then it keeps on going. There's a tertiary level. These fish are eating the smaller fish, and then finally the quaternary consumer, the fourth level consumer, is eating the large fish, and that's our big shark. So this is kind of how a food chain works. I do want to point out that the arrows here indicate the direction the energy goes. Okay, so the energy goes from the producer to the consumer, from the tertiary consumer to the quaternary consumer. Okay, so the arrow points the way the energy goes. Now there are some other players in food chains. Sometimes you'll see a secondary consumer that will eat either plants or fish. A bear is an example. The bear eats berries here, but he also will eat fish. So some secondary consumers eat both. We call them omnivores. And some secondary consumers actually, rather than eating the flesh of something, they break down things that have already died and are decaying. We call these guys decomposers. Here are some examples. We have some fungus, some mushrooms. This is a dung beetle. So sometimes decomposers are breaking down feces, the waste of other organisms rather than their bodies. So he's got a nice dung ball here. And then we have the millipede, which eats sort of dried leaves and dead sticks and stuff like that. Now, we've been talking about a food chain, but really interactions in ecosystems are much more complex than that. A food chain represents just one set of relationships, one chain of relationships, but really in the environment we see a food web, many more interactions between lots of different organisms. So a food web might look something like this. We have the producer here, the grass. We have 1, 2, 3 primary consumers, 3 herbivores, the grasshopper, the rabbit, and the mouse. And then we have the snake, which is a secondary consumer, and the lizard is a secondary consumer. And then we have, of course, the highest level, the eagle, which is eating a bunch of different things. Here's another one looking at a marine ecosystem, a marine food web. We have plankton as our primary consumers, and then they're eaten by the razor clam, which is eaten by both the horseshoe crab and diamondback terrapin. And the horseshoe crab is eaten by the loggerhead turtle and the striped bass. And the eggs of the horseshoe crab are eaten by the sanderling and the grackle. So you see the horseshoe crab here is eaten by many things. It's not just a single Now, when we talk about energy, it's important to understand that most of the energy when an animal eats another animal or an animal eats a plant, most of that energy doesn't get passed along directly. Most of the energy is lost as heat. Only 10% of the energy is passed along to that next organism. That means that when you get further and further along the chain, there's not enough energy. So that's why we don't see food webs and food chains getting too many levels in them, too many top carnivores in them, for instance. So very few top predators in an ecosystem, and that's just simply because there isn't enough energy available. So we represent it usually something like this. This is a grassland. We call this a food pyramid or an energy pyramid. So we might start out with all of this grass, which is eaten by the prairie dogs, but you can't have as many prairie dogs as you have grass because, of course, the prairie dogs have to eat a lot of grass to get energy. And then you have the wolves at the top. There are secondary consumers. They're going to have to eat a lot of prairie dogs to survive, so there can't be too many of them at the top. So as you go up the pyramid, you have a fewer and fewer number of organisms and less amount of energy available.